Hi, this is Troy Hunt, and welcome to Hack Your API First. This course is going to be all about how to identify vulnerabilities in the APIs behind many of the rich client apps we build today. Now, this course is a great continuation of one of my previous courses, Hack Yourself First, How to Go on the Cyber Offense. Now, that course was all about finding common vulnerabilities in web applications. Could be any technology stack, and they're vulnerabilities you can easily find, mostly in the web browser and a few common development tools. This time, we're going to move on to mobile apps and apply the same approach, that is, risks and vulnerabilities that you can easily find yourself in any app of any technology stack. You don't have to have seen the first course for this one to make sense, but if you're doing any web development, I do highly recommend it. That said, let's jump into the course and start talking about connected devices. In this course, these are the sorts of devices that we're going to be most commonly referring to. Things like smartphones or modern Windows apps, tablets. Doesn't matter what make or model they are, if they talk over the web via HTTP or HTTPS, then we're going to cover them in this course. Now, of course, these devices talk to back-end services built in all sorts of different web technologies on different frameworks. And the great thing about this course is that it's equally relevant regardless of what's running on the server. And I've made sure it makes sense to everyone by ensuring that we're really just looking at externally observable patterns. So things we'll see in tools that aren't specifically tied to, say, .NET or PHP or Node or any specific server framework. That keeps it broadly relevant to anyone building APIs and rich clients that consume them. One of the things I'd like to touch on before we start delving into the APIs themselves is just how important it is these days to focus on the security of the services behind rich apps. And I'd like to show you some statistics that should hopefully reinforce the messages that we'll be covering in this course. Here's a chart of the number of apps in Apple's iOS App Store since about the middle of 2008, all the way through to the present time of recording, which is about mid-2014. It is an astronomical growth, and at the present time, we're approaching 1.2 million apps in Apple's App Store. It's a very similar story with Google's Play Store. They kicked in a little bit later, but by many reports, they're even bigger now. Regardless, they're both north of 1 million apps in the store, and a huge proportion of those talk over the web using the sorts of services that we're going to be looking at. Now, the number of apps is one thing, but the number of devices that these apps have made their way onto is really staggering. And in fact, when we look at the figures, we can see that we're approaching 80 billion downloads of apps to date. Now, apparently the average mobile device today has somewhere between 40 and 50 different apps installed on it. And again, a significant portion of those are talking over the web. Put that in the context of this graph heading up towards the 80 billion mark. Again, that's just for Apple. That's not Google Play, that's not Windows Store, and it's not the other providers out there that distribute apps through other channels, yet they still talk over the web to communicate with back-end services. All of these are in the scope of this course. But of course, if you are building mobile apps, the scale and the significance is probably nothing new to you, but it is important to set that context about just how ubiquitous these apps and services are becoming in today's technology world. But there's something else that's happening in our technology space today that's also very significant. Let's take a quick look at that before we move on. we are now well and truly entering this era that has become known as the Internet of Things. Now, things is a pretty generic term, and in reality, it covers pretty much anything which is a connected device. So anything that has a communication channel, and very frequently, that communication channel with external services is again over HTTP, over the web. So let me give you a few examples, because all of these fall into the scope of what we're going to cover in this course. So first up, Withings scales. I have a set of these myself. They're great. You stand on them, obviously. They take your weight. They also take your fat mass, and then they talk over an API via the web to a back-end service. How Withings secures their service is critical when it comes to protecting their customer data. And we're now starting to talk about health data as well. So that's pretty sensitive information. Another good example that can have a serious security impact are physical security devices. This is Lockitron. It sits over your deadlock on an existing door. So it's a retrofit, but it is an IP-enabled retrofit that you can control from your smartphone and that operators can control from a central location. They control it, once again, via HTTP services over the web. It is another device dependent on the sort of APIs that you're probably building if you're watching this course. One more before we move on, and this is a pretty significant one. Cars, in this case Tesla, have provided an API framework where developers can communicate over HTTP with Tesla's services and subsequently with vehicles. This is serious stuff when developers start having the ability to connect to vehicles. It's very early days too. So we're going to see a lot more, not just of Teslas and door locks and connected scales, but of all sorts of devices or things that are connected to the internet using HTTP-based services. So we're actually becoming extremely reliant on these services. But the other thing is that they're sort of out of sight. They sit behind the veneer of either interfaces on our devices, like our smartphones and tablets, or they run in the background when I stand on the scales each morning. So they're not quite as immediately obvious as something like a web page that you're loading in your browser. And in many ways, that creates its own risks. This course is going to teach you how to find those risks. And not only that, but it's also going to teach you what the secure patterns look like. Because obviously the ultimate goal here is to help you go away and write more secure apps, of which a very significant component is frequently the APIs. Now, I just touched on how APIs behind these sort of devices and apps tend to be a little bit out of sight. Let's move on, and I'm going to give you an example of what I mean by that.